The comments from the last session on nationalism serve as a segue into this next session, before afternoon tea at 4. Nationalism in practice, and we have three diverse and very interesting speakers speaking about two very important aspects of nationalism and also sovereignty, I think. Particularly, first up, we have Jeff Neilson from the University of Sydney speaking on food sovereignty. And later, we'll have Eve Warburton here from the ANU speaking about resource nationalism. And then finally, we have Yose Rizal Damuri speaking about a very important recent survey that's just been completed by CSIS on attitudes around globalisation in Indonesia. But first I should ask Jeff to come up to present his paper. Jeff is a geographer at the Sydney University and has lived and worked in Indonesia for the best part of 25 years. And his research interests include agrarian livelihoods and change, land reform, food sovereignty that he'll speak of today, and the impacts of value chain sustainability on programs for rural communities. So I give the floor to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Alistair. And I apologise to be the one that's between you and getting access to your food this afternoon in the afternoon tea break, but we'll see if we can get through it fairly quickly here. So that's right. I want to talk about the emergence of this idea of food sovereignty. And I'll mention a little bit kedaulatan pangan and sometimes food sovereignty. I'll slip between the two, and they seem to be direct translation of each other. However, one point I do want to make is actually what is meant by kedaulatan pangan in Indonesia, I think is very different to what we know of as food sovereignty in the international literature. So this is a term that actually started being widely used in Indonesia in the latter half of the Yudhoyono government, and then has continued throughout the Jokowi government in Indonesia. And it started to dominate the food landscape, food policy landscape in the country. So what I'd like to do is present the emergence of this discourse in Indonesia as being driven by a perceived need to protect the nation, or the Bangsa, which has deep historical roots, but which is not necessarily aimed to protect the individuals and households living within that nation. And indeed, the Indonesian variant of food sovereignty relies on a rather limited, scale-specific and state-centric understanding, and that I would argue serves to a larger purpose of protecting the state and state-linked actors. So first of all, I just want to contextualise that this discursive arena of food sovereignty sort of floats around the very real challenges that Indonesia still faces in ensuring nutritious food is available to its population. Indonesia has the second highest rates of stunting in Southeast Asia, at 37%. And importantly, these rates of stunting have not decreased over the last decade or so, as other indicators of poverty alleviation and indeed food security have. Stunting and malnutrition have tended to remain stubbornly high. And it's done so in the context of otherwise increasing per capita GDP. So you can see here, Indonesia is something of an outlier here in terms of rates of malnutrition for countries of a similar level of GDP per capita. In terms of wasting, and wasting is an acute form of malnutrition, Indonesia actually has the highest rates of wasting in Southeast Asia. So these rates have increased, and the Indonesian policy in this regard seems to be relatively unequipped or ill-equipped to deal with these challenges. The second key challenge I think Indonesia faces is the geographical unevenness of food vulnerability in the country. So it's taken here from the World Food Programme, and in 2015 in their atlas shows that about 52 out of the 58 districts across the country that are identified as being severely vulnerable to food insecurity are located in Papua, Maluku and Nusa Tenggara Timur. So there's a very strong geographical dimension to food insecurity. Now, over the last 50 years, there's been a major shift in the way that sort of people thinking about food insecurity at the global scale think about and conceptualise food security. In the past, it was thought of in exclusively Malthusian terms. Is there enough production to meet consumption? There was a simple arithmetic there. However, the work of Amartya Sen, in particular, and his 1981 book, Poverty and Famines, was something of a watershed in understanding the inner nature of food security or food insecurity. Through case studies of the Bengal Famine in the 1940s and in Ethiopia and Bangladesh in the 1970s, he presented the argument that famine does not necessarily occur as a result of food shortage, but rather from the absence of resources at the household level to access food. And in the opening lines of his book, Sen writes, "Starvation is a characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat." And goes on to say that while the latter can be the cause of the former, it is but one of many possible causes. And whether and how starvation relates to food supply is a matter of factual investigation. So Sen's work led to this idea of thinking about food insecurity primarily in terms of access to food. And indeed, the current definition held by the FAO of what food security is very much emphasises this notion of people, individuals, households having access to food. And it's become widely presented in terms of 4 variables. First being that of food availability or food supply. Secondly, the economic and physical access to food. Thirdly, food utilisation, and particularly the way that households access certain aspects of nutrition in food. And then finally, the stability of those other 3 over time. So such, dominant presentations of food security at the international level tend to identify states as being potential impediments to the free flow of food rather than being essential actors. And it tends to emphasise, the role of markets in distributing food to those that need it most. Now, the idea at the international level of food sovereignty has emerged in recent years and should be understood primarily as a reaction against the belief in the dependence on market-based mechanisms to allocate food to those that need it most. And food sovereignty is closely associated with La Via Campesina, the international peasant organisation linked in Indonesia to Serikat Petani Indonesia, and indeed the secretariat for La Via Campesina was based in Jakarta for 7-8 years under Henry Saragi. Now this broader movement exists within an agitation against globalisation and particularly the influence of transnational corporations, and is characterised by a land reform agenda and demands for peasant and community rights. However, this sort of pro-peasant approach to food sovereignty that's found particularly in the international movements contrasts with the emergence of the food sovereignty or the kedaulatan pangan discourse in Indonesia, which has followed a rather different and I'd say historically informed path. So Sukarno set the foundational terms of this discourse in a widely quoted speech from 1952, which I believe was the inauguration of Bogor Agricultural University, where he implored the crowd, why bother talking about political freedom if we don't have freedom to manage our rice and always have to beg for help buying rice from our neighbouring nations. So not only did he equate here trade with begging, but he also went on to espouse a modernist vision of large-scale mechanised agriculture in the outer islands. And he argued for the need to feed the Bangsa, as if this abstract, the idea of the nation, this abstract notion of the nation, as if that Bangsa itself could somehow feel hunger. The idea of access by individuals to food was not touched upon within Sukarno's landmark speech. However, this speech continues to be read within Indonesia, and indeed was quoted by Jokowi in the launch of the 2015 Food Security Atlas. And this Sukarnoist insistence that masalah pangan is a soal hidup mati bangsa kita has been this idea of food being a matter of life or death for the nation has been rehearsed word for word by Jokowi throughout 2017. Now, ironically, of course, Sukarno's presidency ended with large-scale food insecurity across the country, and yet it has gone on to become the underlying discourse for how food and food policy is understood in Indonesia. Now, Now, although I realise now, I found out this morning that this is he who shall not be named. We're not supposed to mention the leader of the new order. However, he was pivotal in many ways. First of all, I think he set the mould for these fantastic farmer harvest imagery that all sort of subsequent presidents of Indonesia have used quite regularly. And he continued this feeding the Bangsa logic, but he did it alongside heavy investment in rural infrastructure, subsidies, extension, and a form of regulated trade. Importantly, he claimed to have reached swasembada pangan, so in rice, rice self-sufficiency, in 1984, to much acclaim, and he later said that was the proudest single achievement of his presidency. Now, it's important to point out, as Acho has in a recent publication, not only was that 1984 achievement of rice self-sufficiency fleeting, but if we go back over at least a 100-year period, we can see there's only been 3 periods where Indonesia has in fact been self-sufficient in rice. So trade has long been the norm over the last 100 years and arguably for much longer. Now, as has often been noted, the SBY era, or the post-Reformasi era in general, once Indonesia got over the brief period of following IMF reforms, has been increasingly protectionist, with further import restrictions and subsidies in an attempt to stimulate domestic rice and agricultural production. And in a climate of rising nationalism, particularly in Yudhoyono's second term, came associated with these ambitious targets of reaching national self-sufficiency in corn, sugar, soybeans, beef. These are sort of the 5 key commodities that are often used now in terms of food policy, and indeed his aims to achieve a 10 million tonne surplus in rice. It goes without saying, perhaps, that none of these were reached by the end of 2014. However, what did come out of that period was the 2012 food law. And this, in this climate of rising nationalism, and it remains a tangible insight into contemporary food discourse in Indonesia. It introduces the concept of kedaulatan pangan for the first time, as far as I'm aware, into Indonesian legislation, and it defines it here in a very state-centric way. So the international debates over food sovereignty in many parts of the world are actually quite anti-state, whereas in Indonesia here it comes across as the right of the state and the nation. And I should say Bangsa and negara and Bangsa, are used throughout the law in the one sense. So somehow it's inseparable. So the state and the nation are inseparable throughout the food law. And also notably is that the 3 different terms of food sovereignty, food self-sufficiency and food security are also, without exception, used interchangeably throughout the food law as well. So there's no attempt even to distinguish any difference between those 3. And the idea being that they're to be achieved essentially through a singular focus on national scale self-sufficiency. And the law itself also gives a pivotal role to the state to manage all aspects of food policy. It explicitly states the need or the desire to be self-sufficient in food, broadly speaking. Doesn't actually specify in what commodities, the assumption being that Indonesia is to be self-sufficient in all food commodities. Now, President Jokowi has continued to personify the Bangsa in relation to food, with the Nawacita manifesto explicitly linking political sovereignty with economic self-sufficiency. And the literal feeding of the Bangsa is now held to be something sacrosanct, perhaps, in modern political discourse in Indonesia. We've continued over the five main commodities and aims to be self-sufficient in, but the current government has also supported that with a significant increase in funding towards the Ministry of Agriculture. So you can sort of see here the very large increase, particularly in input subsidies and infrastructure that the Jokowi government has invested in. But as also shown here with this green line, which is the ratio of spending to agricultural output, which has also increased sharply over those 2 years, indicating that the massive increase in funding has not been accompanied by a commensurate increase in agricultural food production. Now, furthermore, in what I consider to be a somewhat worrying development is that the rhetoric of food sovereignty and its link to the need to defend the nation has also triggered the involvement of village-level military units, Bangsa, in supervising farm production across the country. And of course, given the somewhat uneasy relationship the military has with various peasant organisations in the Indonesian past, it's a concern to think that the military may also be intervening and supervising over farm production. So while rice self-sufficiency or food self-sufficiency in general may be technically feasible, it comes at quite a high price. So what I want to talk through now is just turn to the policy implications that have emanated from this dominant food sovereignty discourse in Indonesia, and present two examples of how it may inadvertently be actually contributing to food insecurity for poor households. So I'll first talk through the development of large-scale food estates and then the import restrictions that are placed on food products. So the prototype, I would say, for large-scale food estates in Indonesia was the Suharto era, sorry I mentioned his name, the Suharto era mega rice project in central Kalimantan, whereby 1.4 million hectares of land was designated and identified to be converted to rice farms, using primarily transmigrant labour. Now, while this scheme spectacularly managed to fail to meet its objectives, it did manage to significantly disrupt peatland hydrology and led to increase in forest fires in Kalimantan over the subsequent years. Now, in 2014, satellite imagery found that half the original mega rice area was now covered by degraded lands, and a further 38% still had forest cover, and only about 12% was actively being farmed. As you hopefully can see here, that something like 28% of the area is now actually covered by palm oil concessions. And poverty rates in the area have been reported across the whole area to be 36%. The livelihoods for many local communities, particularly in relation to rattan collecting, have been disrupted, and even amongst some of the transmigrant communities, poverty rates in some of those villages have been reported at as high as 75%. Now, despite that history of large-scale food estate production in Indonesia, a very similar model was developed under SBY, with the 1.2 million hectare Merauke integrated food and energy estate in West Papua. The difference being that here, instead of promoting transmigrant labour, there was an emphasis very early on in the role of large corporate actors in being involved in food production. Now, the initial concept for MIFI, and although I think the acronym has since changed, since under Jokowi, but the original impetus for it came during the 2008 global commodity price hike, whereby it was seen that in an attempt to anticipate an energy and food crisis, the Merauke region, and this is from the 25-year master plan document, has been established as the energy and food barn of eastern Indonesia. Again, we have the long list of crops, particularly food crops that are identified as that would be produced under MIFI, and not surprisingly, to date, none of which have been produced. Most of the reports I'm hearing out of Merauke. However, there have been a number of concessions for sugarcane, oil palm, and timber. So the strategic deployment of food sovereignty discourse was integral to ensuring support for this scheme in Papua. And the irony, of course, again, is that the program has been strongly resisted by several local communities, such as the Marin people, who claim that their traditional livelihoods and food security, ironically, are being threatened. Now, Jokowi has continued to support MIFI under a new acronym, and here he was in 2015 aboard a combined harvester, which I'm told was taken at one of the research experimental sites, continuing Sukarno's dream of sort of mechanised food production in the outer islands. In truth, the scheme appears to be a thinly veiled corporate land grab, which happens to be underpinned by food sovereignty discourse. And the list of companies involved reads like a who's who of the political elite in Jakarta. I think Arifin Ponegoro's Medco Group is very, very heavily involved, Peter Sondak's Rajawali, Wilmar, etc. And with the exception of one Korean firm, most of the international firms have since pulled out, due largely to the concerns over land tenure in the area. This, of course, is this vision of food sovereignty, Indonesian style, or at least as envisaged by the state, is a far cry from the visions of peasant-based food sovereignty purported by the likes of Olivia Campesina and SPE. And interestingly, even despite the ongoing failings of Merauke as well to generate food production, Jokowi's continued to promote the development of new similar food estates in the border regions in both Kalimantan and Riau. Interestingly, using the same logic of national protection of the borderlands with food sovereignty to promote the cause. Okay, the second key area I just wanted to discuss rather briefly is trade protectionism, which is also given considerable oxygen through food sovereignty rhetoric. Now, the metaphorical Quran impor that we have here is used as something of a hammer. I'm glad to hear Murray still has a sense of humour about the Quran impor, which is used as something of a hammer for which to hit over the head of pro-trade ministers and politicians, use of colour here being the target. However, it seems that the import licensing regime is the real winner from this rhetoric, as lucrative rents are generated through domestic and international price differences. And this is evident from the various high-profile convictions of politicians caught receiving bribes in exchange for licences. Here we have former PKS President Lutfi Hassan in relation to beef import quotas, and earlier this year, Irman Gusman as well, for receiving bribes in relation to sugar imports. Now, paradoxically, politicians actually justify import quota restrictions on the basis that they're standing up to some nebulously defined import mafia. Now, here you can see the widening gap, often noted between Indonesian and regional rice markets, that provides a sort of opportunities for rent-seeking activities for the likes of Lutfi and Gusman. Now, the relationship, of course, between restrictions, higher prices and poverty has been widely discussed, and it's generally, since most Indonesians are net buyers of food, even Indonesian farmers are actually mostly net buyers of food, therefore any increase in the price of rice and other food items tends to increase rates of poverty and subsequently malnutrition. So from the perspective of poor households, any sort of policy that acts to prevents imports at any cost, and here reflected in the very high implicit taxes paid by Indonesians, is very hard to defend. I guess my point here is that due to the increasingly hegemonic status of food sovereignty discourses, there seems very little debate about the efficacy of food import restrictions and who really benefits. So, in conclusion then, I guess I'll go back to Kedaulatan Pangan to emphasise the difference, is only marginally related to the broader politics of food sovereignty in the world, and instead favours a state-centric vision of what it means for the Bangsa to be food secure. And in Jokowi's words, the state needs to be present, since Negara and Bangsa are essentially undifferentiated. Secondly, the deployment of food sovereignty discourse prioritises the national scale above all others, and so tends to ignore individual concerns over food access, household nutritional needs, and indeed community concerns over rights to land and livelihoods. So key policies flowing from food sovereignty discourses, in Indonesia anyway, do not address fundamental concerns of malnutrition or the poor's access to food, and indeed the spatial unevenness of food vulnerability. But these discourses do, however, strengthen the position of the state and do deliver clear benefits to several state-based actors. And I guess perhaps most importantly, in a political sense, is that food sovereignty, or Kedaulatan Pangan, does seem to resonate well with the electorate. So particularly if he faces off again with Prabowo, as it seems to be predicted he will, who is going to present, who's already cultivating this very ultra-nationalist, strategy, and as a former head of a large farmer organisation, his chances for re-election may indeed hinge on his ability to successfully project his credentials in this area. So at that, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and very strong resonances from Vedi's session this morning on the oligarchy and a lot of the underlying analysis there, I think. And perhaps more to continue that theme now from Eve, who, as many of you know, was the presenter of the very widely discussed session on new developmentalism at Jokowi's leadership at last year's political update. Eve is a PhD candidate here in the Department of Social and Political Change at the Coral Bell School at the ANU, and as a Master of Arts and Human Rights from Columbia University, where she's focused on human rights responsibilities of business. And today, as I said before, she'll be speaking about resource nationalism, Indonesia's elusive industrial dream. Thank you, Eve.
Thanks, Alistair. And good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about economic nationalism as it pertains to the mining sector. And specifically, I want to talk today about the decision that the Jokowi government made earlier this year to relax a ban on the export of raw mineral ores. It was a ban that had been in place since January 2014. And the goal of the ban, so under the Yudhoyono government, I should confirm. And the goal of the ban was to compel mining companies to invest in downstream industrialisation, so to smelt or to refine their mineral ores domestically, and so that they would then be exporting higher value mineral products. This sounds a little dry, but I promise it's going to be fascinating. And this particular policy contributed to Indonesia's reputation at the time as a country that was marked by resource nationalism. It's a term that refers in the broader sense to efforts by state and non-state actors to exert more control over their resource industries and to extract more value from their resource industries. Now, it was a very controversial policy at the time, but 3 years in, by January of this year, it had had some success. So there was a downstream industry growing, particularly in the nickel sector, and we had billions and billions of dollars invested from overseas investors in the downstream sector. And when Jokowi came to power in late 2014, he expressed his personal support, not just for the concept of value adding, but for the mineral export ban specifically. So what compelled the president's change of heart earlier this year? Why did he risk all this investment in the downstream sector? Well, one of the predominant explanatory narratives has been that this policy backflip was a very simple response to budget pressures, and that it was a clear example of how once a commodity boom is over, resource-rich countries like Indonesia will begin to rein in their nationalist interventions. But I think that proposition actually misses the mark, and it misses the bigger picture of what was going on with this particular policy. And what I argue in this paper is that Jokowi's decision to relax the mineral export ban was primarily about supporting the state-owned mining company Anakatambang, or Antam, whose profits had suffered significantly during the export ban. And I argue that this was part of the administration's broader strategy to boost state-owned mining companies, to support them, to support their financial aspirations, and to prepare them for future acquisitions, and in particular, the acquisition of shares in Freeport, Indonesia. So what we have here is not necessarily a retreat from the nationalist position, but a reorientation of the nationalist priority. And so at the end of the paper, I then offer some broad reflections on what this means, or I offer some reflections on what this means more broadly for the nature of resource nationalism in Indonesia. And I basically argue that we can't really see resource nationalism anymore as sort of coherently tied to an external price mechanism. So it's not epiphenomenal. It doesn't just come and go in response to booms and busts. And rather that it's a feature of a re-emergent developmentalist model in Indonesia, the developmentalist vision for a locally owned and industrialised resource sector. And it's a vision that has support from a broad slice of the Indonesian policy-making elite and a broad slice of Indonesian civil society. And it's undergirded, as we will see throughout my presentation, by a strong political imperative. And therefore, we should see it as a more permanent fixture of Indonesia's economic landscape. So, a little bit of background for those of you who haven't been following the mineral sector as closely as I have. The boom and the ban. So, during the commodities boom, which lasted from about 2003 to 2013 roughly, the volume of mineral and coals being exported from Indonesia's shores exploded. And this brought a lot of new revenue to the central government and to the regional governments in resource-rich provinces from Sulawesi, Kalimantan, Sumatra. But it also raised a lot of concern amongst Indonesian policymakers and politicians, and importantly civil society as well, that Indonesia was exporting its finite resources into larger volume at too cheap a price. And that basically they were shipping off their resources in this raw form as primary commodities. And in the interviews that I've conducted on this particular policy, I was struck by how proponents of the export ban framed it in terms that were very much reminiscent of dependency theory, a very old theory. And so they sort of explained how within policy-making circles, they were anxious about Indonesia's sustained reliance on primary commodities, which of course exposed the economy to poor terms of trade, made it vulnerable to boom-bust cycles. And Indonesia needed more local ownership of its resources and more backward and forward linkages in this industry in order to enjoy the maximum benefit of its resource industries. Without state intervention, so the argument went, Indonesia will just continue to sell its cheap raw commodities to the richer, more industrialised nations, without ever moving up the global value chain itself and without moving beyond its lower middle income status and the trap that it had found itself in. And proponents really framed this particular policy intervention often in emotional terms, tying it to Indonesia's economic identity. At the time, President Yudhoyono and members of his cabinet, and of course particularly Hatta Rajasa, who was a key proponent of the ban, described it as a means of attaining economic sovereignty, or kedaulatan ekonomi. If Indonesia failed to invest now in a program for downstream industrial upgrading, the government argued, it would remain a nation of slaves. So value adding as a concept had broad support across the political spectrum, and this was the logic that underpinned a lot of economic planning that was going on in the resource sectors during the boom, but it was certainly what underpinned the logic of the ban. So what did the ban mean in practice? Well, I should also point out here that this is sort of what the ban meant in practice. So this is an image from Sulawesi. These are just sort of piles of nickel ore, piles of dirt within which there is nickel. And essentially what it meant that for some subsectors, mineral subsectors, they basically ground to a halt. So the ban had different sorts of impacts on different sorts of minerals, but essentially it had the biggest impact on nickel and bauxite. They were the most severely impacted because they were being exported in huge volumes in their raw form, and there was very little smelting capacity or refining capacity in existence. So when the ban came into play in January 2014, this is what the shores of parts of Sulawesi looked like. And the Indonesian government lost somewhere between 3 to 4 billion US dollars in revenue from the nickel and bauxite sectors. Now, a second category of minerals that we can talk about more in the Q&A if we want to actually received a last-minute reprieve in January 2014. So copper and copper concentrates were allowed to continue to be exported, of course, by the two companies that dominate copper concentrate exports, Freeport and Newmont, because they also had no smelters, but they were given another 3 years in which to invest in smelting capacity. So what effect did the ban have? Well, in a sense, did it have the intended effect? Well, it did and it didn't. It didn't really for bauxite for a whole bunch of technical reasons. It's a very energy-intensive enterprise, smelting bauxite. But it did have an effect in the nickel sector, and it began to pay off. So the sector attracted around 15 billion US dollars, mainly from Chinese companies. China was the biggest importer of Indonesia's nickel ores. So they began to invest in the downstream sector. And this is just a table that sort of, well, an image, sorry, a graphic that shows all the different areas where there was some sort of invested in smelting facilities. Now, I'm not saying that Indonesia suddenly had this blossoming, wonderful downstream industry, but the point is that progress was being made, and there was a lot of money being invested into the downstream sector. So essentially, for nickel, the policy was working. So come January 2017, what did the industry sort of expect would happen? Well, bauxite didn't look so good, maybe they would tinker with that, but the consensus was really that the ban, especially on nickel, was here to stay. So why did we get this shift? Why did the government turn its back on the downstream sector? Well, one explanation paints the relaxation of the ban as simply the government's response to financial pressure. The government missed its revenue targets in 2015 and 2016, and so opening the door to exports would basically just help increase revenues from export taxes. even if the contribution will be relatively small. And I want to emphasise that it will be, not just because nickel prices are low, but because the way in which this relaxation has worked is that not any company now can just go and export its raw nickel. It has to apply to the Ministry for Energy and Mineral Resources to get an export permit and an export quota. And only a very, very small number of companies have received that, about 3 or 4, in fact. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But it was a simple argument. The boom was over, so we're seeing the subsiding of this nationalist mobilisation and nationalist intervention. But I'm going to argue, as I said at the beginning, that something else was going on. Oops, sorry, there was my image for budget pressures, a very concerned-looking economic team. But as I said, I want to argue that in fact this was much more about not the health of the budget more broadly, but the health of Aneka Tambang or Antam. Now, prior to the ban, state-owned company Aneka Tambang was one of the largest exporters of Indonesia's raw nickel ores. And it suffered huge financial losses when the ban was introduced. Indeed, around 30% of Antam's revenue was coming from the export of raw nickel and bauxite. So Antam received no special treatment from the Yudhoyono government in 2014. There was no special dispensation for this state-owned company. It was basically thought that Antam would just have to suffer the immediate financial pain in order to eventually, later down the track, become a driver of value-added economic growth. But it was basically didn't have enough smelting capacity. It was unable to export a large amount of its ore, and so its profits nosedived. And this is from one of Antam's annual reports. And you can see gross profit suffered dramatically, or went down dramatically after the ban. But if we did have a table, which they did not put in their annual report, of net profit, you would see that Antam actually went into the red for the first time in over a decade. So, by 2017, the company was then just sitting on 20 million tonnes of nickel that it had stockpiled since the ban, and it desperately wanted to export this stockpile. Now, unlike what Yudhoyono, or the way Yudhoyono treated Antam back in 2014, Jokowi has done something very different. You know, he has promoted more generally state-owned enterprises as champions of the government's economic policies, from infrastructure all the way through to the resource sectors. And in 2015, the government poured trillions of rupiah into Antam in order to try and help boost the company's profits, its output, and help it invest in several downstream projects. Excuse me. And in the lead up to the 2017 regulation, there was a lot of intrigue, a lot of rumours circulating in the industry, and one of them was that this ban would be relaxed just for Antam and not for any other company. Now, of course, that didn't happen. That would be sort of demonstrably unjust, but it was certainly Antam that has stood to benefit the most. It has received the most. It was the first to receive the export permit, and of course, it has the largest quota of any of the nickel companies in Indonesia. And its shares have jumped in response, around 6% actually, right when the export ban was announced, the relaxation of the ban was announced. Now, this theory actually makes much more sense if we think about the broader vision of this administration for the mining sector. And many of you now would know that Rini Somano, the Minister for State-Owned Enterprises, who is of course a very influential member of the Cabinet and a very close political ally of the President, that she has outlined this plan to consolidate state-owned enterprises across a whole range of sectors and to establish state-owned holding companies. And so in the mining sector, which has been a priority for the government, this would basically be a reformed version of PT Inalum, which is the government's state-owned aluminium manufacturer. And as a holding company, PT Inalum would have underneath it Antam, Bukit Asam, PT Timah, and it would have this much more diverse portfolio of assets. And that would give it the ability to sort of leverage finances, to borrow money, to rely less on the government, and basically give it the capacity to acquire shares and to expand its market share, and to expand its market share, and then to acquire shares in lucrative, privately run, foreign-operated mines. And of course, the target has always been Freeport. So Indonesia is now closer than it has ever been, or the Indonesian government is closer now than it has ever been to owning a controlling share in Freeport, Indonesia, which of course runs the Grasberg mine, one of the most profitable gold and copper mines in the world. Now, in the same January regulation that I've been speaking about here, that relaxed the ban on mineral ores and the export of mineral ores, there was another regulation that basically revived an old rule that said if you're a foreign mining company operating in Indonesia, you have to divest 51% of your shares after 10 years in operation. It was actually an old regulation that was introduced under Yudhoyono. Stay with me on this. In 2015, the Jokowi government actually reduced that obligation and said if you're a company like Freeport, you only have to divest 30%. 3 years later, or less than that, 2 years later, it said, nope, scrap that, you're divesting 51%. And just a couple of weeks ago, the government finally seemed to have inked a deal with Freeport to extend its operating licence beyond 2021, which is when its current contract expires. And in return, Freeport conceded and agreed to divest 51% as per the January regulation. So plans are really ramping up now to get this holding company ready, to get it into shape so that it can begin taking some of that 51%. And there's a lot to be worked out. I do want to emphasise that. We haven't agreed on the share price, how to agree on the share price, and how this divestment will really work in practice. But the plans are well and truly in motion. And so by reversing the ban, by supporting Antam, by putting it in a better position financially, the government was helping to put the planned holding company in a better financial position in order to begin this process of taking over part of Freeport's Grasberg mine. So it's really been a reprioritisation or reorientation of the nationalist agenda rather than a retreat from the nationalist position. But the question really is, why did Jokowi do this? As I said just now, wasn't what he set out to do when he first came to power. Freeport was not front of mind right after the elections for him anyway. And indeed, he handed over power to his minister at the time, Sudirman Said, and said, do what you want with this Freeport contract, just make it in the national interest, and gave him the freedom, in fact, to introduce a regulation that reduced Freeport's divestment obligation. So what is this all about? Well, what I want to argue is that there's a strong political imperative, and that over the last 2 years, Jokowi has come to see his nationalist credentials as a political vulnerability, and that he's increasingly seen in the resource sectors, and particularly in the Freeport contract, an opportunity to try and bolster or to fortify his nationalist credentials. And I think we can all agree that getting Freeport to divest a majority of its shares, potentially to a state-owned company, is a huge political win for Jokowi. We all remember, and Ed spoke about this just in the previous session, that back in 2014 it was Prabowo that claimed the nationalist ground. Jokowi did win, but he always seemed to lose to Prabowo on a couple of issues. You know, in the polls, it was always Prabowo that came out as the most tegas, the strongest, or the most berwibawa. You know, he was the one that was authoritative and powerful. These were the characteristics that Prabowo cultivated, of course, because of his military identity, but also through his firebrand nationalism. And since coming to power, Jokowi's clearly felt that this is a political vulnerability for him. So now, and I think this is really important, put all the economics of these decisions aside, whether you agree or disagree with the logic that has underpinned both the export ban, the relaxation, or the divestment obligations. And let's think about it in political terms. Jokowi can now stand in front of a crowd, in front of a media, in front of a campaign rally, in front of the media, and he can say that on my watch, not on Yudhoyono's watch, not on anyone else's watch, for the first time, the government has been able to oversee, or almost oversee, the transfer of 3 of the country's most strategic resource projects into Indonesian hands. The Mahakam gas block, previously run by Total, will now be run by Pertamina. The Newmont's Batu Hijau gold mine now is and the government helped facilitate the takeover of this mine by Medco, Arifin Panigoro's company. And of course, now we have the government is now closer than, as I said, it's ever been to actually taking a controlling share in Freeport, Indonesia. So while the president has many vulnerabilities leading up to 2019, I think we can all agree that his nationalist credentials look to be in pretty good shape. So what does all this tell us about, or what are the broader implications? What does this tell us about the nature of resource nationalism in Indonesia? Well, first of all, as I said at the beginning, nationalist mobilisation and intervention is not clearly a function of an external price mechanism, like a boom or a bust. And instead, resource nationalism or the brand of resource nationalism in Indonesia is particularly persistent. And I think instead we should see it as an expression, or as one element of, a re-emergent developmentalist economic model. in Indonesia. If we look at the sorts of policies that have emerged in Indonesia's resource sectors over the past 5 to 10 years, everything from export bans to export restrictions, new taxes, local content requirements, the new privileges for state-owned companies, all this sort of stuff, if we take it together, we see a model that sort of approximates or shares some of the features of this new developmentalism that scholars have been observing in other resource-rich countries around the world, particularly in parts of Latin America, and I'm thinking specifically of Brazil. Now, what are the features of this new developmentalism? Well, it proposes a greater role for the state in economic planning and industrialisation, but it's not radically nationalist. This is not a Chavez-style nationalism. It doesn't reject a role for the private sector or for markets per se, but it's premised on this notion that the state should intervene in the market in order to protect and boost local companies, both private and state-owned, to support domestic champions as agents of industrial development. Now, these ideas have a long history in Indonesia, and they've been popular in policy-making circles for many years. But, and I've actually made this argument in other publications, in contemporary Indonesia, there's more demand for economic nationalism, and it emanates partly from some sections of an expanded and more autonomous domestic business class, but I think as Ed argued so eloquently before, it also emanates from political actors who perceive a popular preference for nationalist interventions and who so often engage in nationalist outbidding at particular junctures. So, now this is not to say, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that Indonesia approximates an ideal type developmentalist state. The execution of these nationalist interventions is actually often very incoherent. These regulations are revised, retracted, relaxed, and then revived, as we've seen with the divestment requirements and the mineral export ban. In fact, both of these policies have gone through something like 4 to 5 iterations over the past 5 years. And that incoherence and that mutability arises because these regulations tend to undergo adjustments in order to align with shifting priorities of different politico-bureaucratic and politico-business elites. And I think Raden Pardede this morning in the economic update emphasised the degree of institutional regulatory complexity as a result of decentralisation. But in fact, the policies I'm talking about here have all come straight from the top. So even at the national level, this has nothing to do with decentralisation, we have an incredible sort of degree of regulatory ambiguity and mutability. But the point here is this incoherence and this changeability really happens at the implementing stage. And in fact, we're just seeing a reorientation or tinkering with policies or implementing regulations, but the nationalist agenda stays the same. And there's very little debate about that fundamental developmentalist vision. And for that reason, what I would argue is that resource nationalism and the developmentalist vision of which it is a part will persist beyond booms, beyond busts, and beyond electoral cycles. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Eve. The final speaker in this session is Yose Rizal Damuri from CSIS, the head of the Department of Economics there. And his research focus normally is on economic modelling, international trade, and regional integration and globalisation of value chains. Yose also teaches at UI, in International Economics at the Faculty of Economics and Business Studies. And the presentation he's going to give today is about some very important research that's just been done on attitudes towards globalisation in Indonesia. So, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, for a very nice introduction. I'd like to good afternoon. First of all, good afternoon to you all, and it is a really good opportunity for me to be present here. Always good to be back to ANU. I finished my master degree like 17 years ago at the ANU, and so this is a good chance for me to be also present in the Indonesian update. This afternoon, I'd like to present actually a report of our survey. This is just a a fresh report. We just completed the survey just last week, the end of last week. So we haven't really done many analysis on the result of the survey. And this is actually the first time for me to present the survey itself. I haven't even had the time to present it in CSIS, who conducted the survey actually. So let me start my presentations by inviting you to look at the trade policy in Indonesia. I think it's quite knowledgeable. It's quite common knowledge for you in these rooms that the trade policy has become more restrictive during the last couple of years. And then I show you the increasing number of import restrictions. Nowadays, it's around 35% of tariff lines are subject to import restrictions. While, for example, 5 years ago, the figure was only like around 9%. And compared to other ASEAN countries, the average it's quite high. The average was only around 17%, while in Indonesia it reached the number of 35%. I think this is in line to what Eve and also Jeffrey mentions about economic nationalisms. This is also an examples on how economic nationalisms is in Indonesia perhaps is there. Still there, and perhaps also even increasing. And the problem is, how do you explain more restrictive trade policy? I think it's quite interesting that Eve mentions, also Jeff to some extent, that it's related to the political process and the democratic process in Indonesia. How that public opinions, perhaps, and also the voters' perceptions toward trade policy, toward economic nationalisms being built so far. And I think some of the political economy theory on trade policy also mentions about this phenomena, look at this phenomena, like, for example, median voters theorems. But how to check this kind of argument? How to check this kind of hypothesis that it boils down to the public perceptions and also to get more vote, to get more support in the electoral process. So this study is trying to look at that phenomena. We're trying to look at perspective of public opinion to see whether public opinion in Indonesia is more in favor of toward openness, economic openness, or toward restrictions. And also, we will also look at how these perceptions can be linked to the policy outcomes. In order to do that, we conducted 2 activities. The first one is a public opinion survey. It's a nationwide survey which was conducted last month. And then some questions are intended to capture the attitude toward economic openness, globalization. Also about some questions are also about sovereignty and the national identity. While we also put more attention to young generation like me. Yes. So we did oversampling for millennials and how they see this kind of process. Another activity that we conducted was try to look at the content analysis of media in Indonesia. It's complementing the survey, content analysis of 2 major newspapers. The time period was covered 2 months before Indonesia's general election up to the presidential election. So it's around 6 months, 6 months of time. Okay, let me start with the public opinion survey. This is the descriptions of our survey. There are 1,600 people were surveyed. The survey was based on a random sampling method. Although it is we use multi-stage random sampling instead of nationwide random sampling. We conducted random sampling at the several stages, like in district level and then at the village level as well. The data is collected by face-to-face interview. Each interview collected the information from 10 respondents. The survey was conducted for the whole week of the last week of August. I think this is the one of few survey who try to look at the public perceptions on globalization in Indonesia. Especially it is quite unique because we did it at the using random sampling. And we hope that by doing that, the representativeness of the survey is more is increasing or better than many other surveys. To give you some flavors on the characteristic of the survey, we see I've mentioned before that we put emphasis on the young population also. So we have more proportions toward people under 30. The educations, high school, around half of the respondents are high school graduate. We have proportionate number of male and female, and a little bit more respondent from Java compared to outside Java, because this is a proportionate sampling, random sampling that we did. So let me start with the general perception on openness, especially economic openness. So we try to divide the economic openness into 4 aspects. The first one is on the aspect of imports. What do you think about products from abroad? Or what do you think about imports? And we try to look at whether the perception is different toward the economy, the Indonesian economy, and toward the personal, the respondent itself. So we can see that around less than a half of the respondent actually see the benefit of imported product. Only less than a half. The majority do not really see the benefit of imported products. And you can also see, even if we ask at the personal level, then you can see that the number is even smaller. Only 42% that sees the benefit of imports. This is the first aspect that we try to look at. The second aspect is how they see the investment, how they see how Indonesian look at the foreign companies operating in Indonesia. Here, I think the number is more promising, like around 55% of the respondent answers positively, especially if we look at the benefit of investment to the Indonesian economy, but they don't see it for themselves. They don't see, less people see the benefit of foreign investment to themselves at the personal level, only like around 45%. The third aspect is to what is the perception to foreigners as foreign visitors, like tourists or people coming for doing business and those kind of things. So this is more positive for sure. Like around 70% of the respondents answer positively for both case to the Indonesian economy and also at the personal level. But this change, the perception changed a lot significantly if we look at those foreigners not only as visitors but rather as foreign workers. So the proportion that answers positively dropped up to only 20%. And even if they are asked to evaluate from their personal interest, it's only around 15% that sees the benefit of foreign workers in Indonesia. So those four aspects, I think, are quite interesting to see and to look at, especially on how those four aspects also shape the policy formulations and also the policy related to openness in Indonesia. But we haven't done it. We haven't done that kind of analysis yet. So I'm going on to present the survey. I think we are also interested in looking at what Indonesians see the international cooperation forums, and it turns out that they think it's quite beneficial. Around 70% of the public sees these international cooperation forums to be beneficial to Indonesian economy. And I think this is also quite an interesting question, whether the globalization threatening national unity of Indonesia. I think Aspinall already talked a lot about the sources of nationalism, but it turns out our survey says that only 40% of our respondent sees the globalization process as a threat to national unity. Of course, this is quite a quite big figure. 40% is not small, although it's not majority. But whether this also shape the political economy narrative in Indonesia, we still need to see it. Another things that I'd like to share here, it's quite interesting. If we look at some characteristics of respondents and link it to their perceptions toward economic openness. For example, if we look at based on the education attainment, that you can see that negative perceptions over four aspects of openness are quite similar to each other from one level of education to another. Even for the undergraduate university graduate, only 50% that sees import as less threatening or quite beneficial. While I think they also agree that the foreign workers are totally not beneficial to Indonesian economy. So this kind of things also set lights on how education perhaps do not really change the perceptions of Indonesian toward economic openness. Another things that we can see is that how different the perceptions toward access to media. One of our questions in the questionnaire to look at how frequent they access media, including radio, television, newspaper, and online media. And this is the figure for those who access media for 5 times or more in a week. So we've seen that the negative perception is still there, despite that they become more. There are more exposure toward the media, or they don't really access media so frequent. They still don't see. They still have a good or high negative perceptions on economic openness. Another aspect that we try to look at in our survey is how Indonesians feel confidence toward competing at the global level. Unfortunately, this question is only for millennials, so we cannot really compare between the other age group. The first question is Indonesia able to compete at global level? And they feel confident about it. 60% say very capable. Another 20% also say that Indonesia would be able to compete at global level. What about yourself? Are you going to be able to compete at global level? And it's also still positive. 75% still quite positive, still quite optimistic about the competitions at global level. But they also see that they need to upgrade their skill, especially for the technological change. In other questions, we also ask whether they aware of the technological change, and most of them also aware of this technological change at global level. Another question is about how they optimistic about the future, you can see around 90%, more than 90% of the respondents see the futures quite optimistic about their futures. Although you can see that another questions that we ask about what is the most important aspect in your life, then many of them sees health as the most important aspect. But that especially for older age group. The younger one, the millennial, perhaps don't really see health as their problems. It's quite reasonable, I guess. 20 years ago, I don't really care about my health. They see success and also spare time with family as something that being regarded to be quite important. Since this year marks the anniversary of ASEAN, for 50 years anniversary of ASEAN, we also include several questions about ASEAN, and we try to see their knowledge about ASEAN. One of the questions is trying to ask them to mention 3 ASEAN member countries, and almost 70% of them can answer the 3 ASEAN member countries. Yeah. I think in other questions we also try to ask them whether they know what ASEAN stands for, and 60% of them can answer it quite well. And another question is about AEC, whether the AEC is beneficial to Indonesia, and the majority, around 85%, agree that the AEC is beneficial to Indonesia. And which country do you want to go work for? If you have a chance to work in other ASEAN countries, the answer is Singapore for sure. And Singapore is the most favorite other ASEAN country among Indonesians, especially among millennials. And I guess it's not hard to guess which one is the devious country in ASEAN. I wouldn't give the answer. You can guess. It's easy. Although quite interestingly, China is also the least favorite outside ASEAN. So the negative perception toward China is, I think, quite in line to what Safia Fifi mentioned or described in the previous presentation. And in order to complement our survey, we also try to look at the content analysis, Indonesian media content during the election time. And then we analyzed 327 articles related to international issues, trade, SOEs, natural resource, and FDI, and all other kind of articles. We found 575 sentiments, 388 among 2/3 are quite positive, has quite positive sentiments toward economic openness. And interestingly, academics tend to be have more negative view toward economic openness here, the academics in Indonesia, compared to other resource persons such as government official, which is quite remarkably, 80% of them send the positive message toward media. And then we further classified several themes related to socio-economic issues. And then we found, although during the election time, that we have seen, or we have heard a lot about resource nationalism from Prabowo and Jokowi during that time. It didn't appear much at the media. I don't know why. Perhaps we still need to explore more media, or to look at other medias, also including social media. But here, from the negative sentiment, this one is negative sentiment. We found only 15 articles that mentions about the risk of Indonesia losing its domestic assets, including also natural resources. From around 377 articles. So it's quite interesting, this kind of finding. We still need to dig deeper about these findings, and then how it relates also to the explanations of the political process and the policy formulations in Indonesia. So this is just a preliminary insight from the survey result and also the content analysis. I think you can see that the public perception toward openness is less favorable than we expected. Majority of respondents tend to see little benefits of imports and even FDI, and it's more obvious when we're talking about foreign workers. Millennials, which are assumed to be more exposed toward informations, do not differ much from other age group. Yeah. But they are still quite optimistic about Indonesian future and about their own future, especially in the global environment. And they do have quite good knowledge and perceptions about ASEAN. Our content analysis of Indonesian newspaper are not really in line with the general perception that we gather from the survey. One of the explanation, perhaps because we only look at 2 newspapers, but we're planning to expand the analysis by including more newspapers, especially the one that tend to be more on the nationalistic side. Another explanation is perhaps because social media on online information is more accessible and it's more influential to the Indonesian perception. A little bit on our next agenda is that we are going to do some more statistical analysis, especially to explain the perceptions on why, and use more intensively the information that we gather from the survey. And also, for sure, more analysis on the link between public perception and trade policy making in Indonesia. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very interesting early insight into that research, and there's obviously a lot more that can be gleaned from all of that data. So we've got 15 minutes now for questions and comments, and as ever, just please try to keep your comments or your questions short. I think we can do 3 now, and then maybe another group of 3 before the top of the hour. So maybe the gentleman up the back there, and you miss there in the red top, and one other, the gentleman up the back there. So all 3 of you. And
for the presentation number 3 around mining and nationalism. As you see that Dr. Sri Mulyani has been very active in negotiating of the kicking out of Freeport of the as a share majority holder in Papua. What is your note on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question?
What was the very last bit of the
Sri Mulyani has been very active in supporting Jokowi in the negotiation of the Freeport, kicking out in Freeport as majority shareholders. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the questions first and then answer them. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for Eve. the presentation you are is a very lucrative. I mean, it's really an essence of Indonesian politics, basically. So I wonder, to connect with Ferry Hadi's discussion this morning, would you agree that this all discourse on resource nationalism is part of the instrument of the oligarchy? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman.
Thank you. Hi, my question is to Jeffrey. I'm also doing my research on food sovereignty. I'm a PhD candidate at the Crawford School, so it was very interesting to look at your presentation on food sovereignty in the case of Indonesia. I think food sovereignty itself has been taken to be a very ambiguous type of term, even in the international literature, not like very well defined and having different sorts of elements. And when you presented that the way food sovereignty is being taken in Indonesia is different to what La Via Campesina has been promoting for, I think it also falls into that same thing that it can be interpreted in any way. But what I'm really interested in is when the state has been taking this notion of food sovereignty in the way of promoting these huge estates and where the common concerns of farmers and local livelihoods are not being taken care of, how is Via Campesina at the local level in Indonesia taking this approach that the state is taking on food sovereignty? Is it celebrating it, or how is its relation with the state seen in the context of how it is being taken up? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you. I'll begin with Amalinda's question. So to what extent can we see resource nationalism or expressions of resource nationalism as a function of oligarchy or oligarchic politics? Well, I think the reason that resource nationalism is so persistent in Indonesia, beyond that boom-bust sort of cycle, is because it dovetails so neatly with ideological preferences of a large slice of the bureaucratic class, policy elites, and to the extent that politicians believe that there's a public preference for it. And that dovetails really neatly with certain business interests. So it's as Ed said, nationalism is something that can be mobilized and used and instrumentalized for a whole range of reasons. And, there are particular policies that we can trace back to the interests of politico-business elites. But then there are other policies that we can't so neatly. And so if we maybe talk about divestment, that's the decision to force companies to divest more of their shares is something that resonates widely. It's all about local ownership of Indonesian resources. It's a popular idea. But there's, it's very obvious that there would be Indonesian business people who have expanded their interests in the mining sector and in the resource sectors in a really serious way over the last 10 to 15 years that would benefit directly from that sort of policy. So I think that there's a strong sort of ideological basis for nationalist policies, and that in certain contexts they dovetail neatly with politico-business interests. But I don't think it's driven by oligarchs. I think that that rent-seeking they opportunistically use nationalist interventions rather than necessarily driving them all, if that makes sense. Yeah. Oh, the question about Sri Mulyani, I think that was, I don't know if that was perhaps a comment, but yes, that's true. She sort of took over and really, I think, led the negotiations with Freeport and obviously did a very good job. And I should actually emphasise that, this 51% divestment requirement, not only was that a regulation that was originally introduced by the Yudhoyono administration, but it actually reflects what is in Freeport's contract. But Freeport got out of that clause in the 90s because of a regulation that was introduced by the Suharto administration. So there are many. The idea that Freeport should divest 51%, I mean, that's a very widely held view. And whether you're a staunch nationalist or whether you're a development economist like Sri Mulyani, most people agree that this was the time that this was something that Freeport really had to concede. That it was an issue of fairness. Just to confirm.
Jeff, oh, sorry, yes.
Okay. Yes. I'd like to answer the questions about oligarchs and also this nationalist sentiment. I think if you believe our survey quite representative to that that is quite representative to public perception in Indonesia, you can see that these nationalistic sentiments are also in line with the perceptions of majority of Indonesian. But the question is how that public perception also is the result of influence from the oligarchs. That's another question. Which ones affects to one another? I mean, whether the oligarchs shape the public perceptions, or this public perception simply being translated into nationalist rhetoric among elite, and also nationalist actions like like divestments from Sri Mulyani. I think that's another question that is quite interesting to ask and then to find the answer.
Jeff, yeah. I'd like to answer the last gentleman's question.
Thank you for the question.
Press the button.
Yep. Can you hear me? Yep. So that's right. I didn't mean to give the impression that the international idea of food sovereignty was hegemonic either. You're quite right that it's quite an ambiguous term that's interpreted in different ways in different countries. I guess the unifying theme for the most part, however, is some sort of a pro-peasant stance or a pro-small farmer stance. I guess that was the key distinction I was making with the role of the state, which is emphasised in Indonesia. But you're right, it is quite ambiguous, certainly. In relation to La Via Campesina in Indonesia, it's also quite interesting that so the secretariat here, and it was headed up by Henry Suragi, who was also the head and long-term head of Serikat Petani Indonesia, SPI, and yet I don't know how many of you have heard of La Via Campesina in Indonesia. It doesn't have a very strong public presence, and even Serikat Petani Indonesia also, I wouldn't say has a strong sort of role in policy advocacy, but its emphasis to date has more been in relation to land reform and agrarian reform, and it's also supportive of import restrictions in an attempt to stimulate production, but its primary focus here has been agrarian reform in the sense of resisting land being taken over by corporations in the state has been the primarily focus. Yep.
Thank you, Jeff. Let's have another, we can have one more round of three. Yes? Dede is the first, and two others. Yeah? Ross? Yeah, and Zuli. Yeah, there are three of you. So, Pak Dede first.
Thank you, Pak Alistair. Just clarification from Jose. I wonder if you can help me to understand your survey. Because when you mentioned about the perception of the respondents, the one that support thinks that import is good, you classified as very advantageous, right? Advantageous. And less advantageous means that they are also supporting the import, but relatively less. And advantageous enough, it means that they are also supporting import. So the one who refuse, who against import, is only not advantageous. If you look at from the result, that majority are basically open to import. Is it the right
no,
explanation?
The first one and two, the very advantageous, very beneficial and beneficial enough, advantageous enough, can be considered to see the import as positive, but not less advantageous one.
Oh, less advantageous means
because the question is tidak menguntungkan.
Okay. Sorry, I understand.
Tidak menguntungkan. The translations, my assistants make some mistakes in the translations, but I didn't have time to change the translation so far. Tidak menguntungkan sama
Well, we'll take that as a question answered, I think. Yeah. We'll hand over to Ross.
Thank you, Ross McLeod from the Indonesia Project, one time at least. My question or comment is for Jeff. You had a very nice chart or graph in the form of a map, which I think was showing something like food deprivation geographically in Indonesia. I just forget exactly what the title was. I'd like to make the observation that if you did a similar graph for deprivation from health services or deprivation from education services, things like that, or deprivation from access to the internet. You know, people worried about the so-called digital divide. I think the map for all of those things would look very, very similar to the map that you put up. And that indicates to me the basic problem, and the basic problem is poverty or lack of income. So when Amartya Sen was talking about needing access to food, well, to me that's just another way of saying people need more income in order to be able to buy food. But it's not just food, it's also health and education and so on and so on. So it seems to me that by portraying this problem as a food problem rather than an income problem, that's exactly what leads governments to implement crazy policies like trying to grow 1 million hectares of rice in Kalimantan peatlands. So I'd like to suggest, encourage you very strongly when you do the finished version of your paper to sort of reflect on this and ask the question, is it really useful to think in terms of food security, or shouldn't we really be attacking the fundamental problem of incomes of poor people? Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll just take the Zuli's question and then we'll get the panellists to respond.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, panel, for the very interesting talks. But Yose, I just would like to ask you, please, if you could, to share with us the figures for globalization look really very interesting. But they don't seem to be, and then you also have other interesting figures about attitudes towards foreign workers, investment, and imported goods. So what do those people who are asked the questions, what did they think globalization meant when they said, yes, it's a great thing? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we might go over to Jeff first to respond to Ross, and then Yose can respond to Zuli.
Yep. So the map was a food vulnerability map, was the one, which is defined essentially. There's a couple of components to identifying food vulnerability, but certainly poverty rates is one, which is why you're looking at the relationship between the other indicators that you're suggesting, which is clearly obvious. The reason why Amartya Sen talks about access is because it recognises the fact that, yes, markets and income are a key way that most people would access, you and I get access to our food, undoubtedly. But there is also opens up the possibility for self-provisioning as well, which of course in Indonesia is still very important. So the idea that a large part of the population is still self-provisioning to some extent is taken into account in Sen's definition of food security. And the other aspect is utilisation of food as well. So even where people have income, they're not necessarily spending it on the most nutritious food types, depending on what's in the market. So as a result of that, that's why people looking into food specifically recognise that there's a need to also understand household, decision-making dynamics about allocation of resources within the household and what sort of decisions they're making on what sorts of food to buy. So I guess what I'd say is that the link is obvious indeed with poverty, but it also doesn't foreclose the possibility there are other ways as well of provisioning and getting access to food beyond higher incomes and markets.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. Since the survey was conducted face-to-face, the interviewer actually had a chance to explain about the questions and about the globalization. So in the questionnaires, we also put the explanation about globalization, which is about the dissolvement of the border, cross-country border, so that there would be a flow of knowledge, culture, goods, and people. And we also mentioned that globalization can be defined or can mean positive or negatively. That kind of globalization's definition, the definition of globalization that we try to explain to the respondents. But the positive attitude towards globalization, it's not really on the at the general level. We also have the social aspects of globalization that we've seen, and the perception which is not really good. This is quite rich survey. This is quite rich questionnaire that we ask. So on the social aspect, like the cultural aspect, the perception is also not that positive. But they still see globalization as not threatening toward the unity of Indonesia. Yeah. That's the clarification.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Could you all give a hand to the three